But because it is Memorial Day and it is a weekend celebration in which I said we will celebrate here in our worship, it's important to recognize why people do what they do. We know some of why people do what they do. Some of it remains a mystery. But for people of faith, we're pretty clear where the directions come. And so our scripture today gives a hint or a taste, or at least a command from Jesus about how far love goes. So if you want to read along, we're going to open up the Gospel of John, chapter 15, and I'll be reading verses 9 through 13. Listen for this love of God. Jesus speaking, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that you may, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. For the purposes of this Memorial Day celebration, Jody and I talked about something we might do together and share a story that isn't Hollywood. It isn't made up. It's absolutely real. Some of you may be aware of the story we're about to present to you, but it's a wonderful testimony of those words we just read from Jesus, of what it is that we're called upon and where that faith that allows us to act in such a way, where does it come from? The other thing that's striking about this story to me is I guess our society to now, it seems like people are pulled apart. There's factions fighting factions, and even sometimes the people of God seem to be fighting themselves. So in this story, you're going to hear 4 very different faith traditions come together to do something quite courageous and quite wonderful. So Jody and I right now will be presenting to you, if you've maybe familiar, it's called The Story of the 4 Chaplains. On February 3rd, 1943, an Army transport ship called the Dorchester was carrying American soldiers through the icy North Atlantic waters. On the way, World War II is raging, so they're on the way to serve in World War II. They're about 100 miles off the coast of Greenland in a very rough sea. More than 900 people were on board the ship, and many of them were little more than boys, young soldiers, sailors. They had never been quite so far away from home. The journey had been arduous already, and the men crammed into these tiny compartments that wasn't made for this many people to be pushed into. It was almost, the air was very thin. The sleeping quarters were well below deck. The soldiers and sailors were constantly ill from the violent rocking of the ship. All of a sudden, they were all awakened from sleep by an attack. As they searched desperately in the dark for life jackets and lifeboats and a safety route, there were 4 chaplains on that ship, military chaplains from 4 very different faith traditions, and they were helping. It was Father John Washington, who was a Catholic priest, Reverend Clark Poling, a senior pastor in a Reformed church, just like it's in any other name, we would call it a Presbyterian church. And Rabbi Alexander Good, a Jewish rabbi, and Reverend George Fox, he happened to be a Methodist pastor.
And between the early days of May to late July, these 4 had entered military service from different areas of the country. Reverend Fox enlisted in the Army from Vermont the same day that his 18-year-old son Wyatt enlisted in the Marine Corps. Now, during World War I, though he was only 17 years old, Fox had convinced the Army that he was actually 18 and enlisted as a Medical Corps assistant. His courage on the battlefield earned him the Silver Star, the Croix de Guerre, and the Purple Heart. When World War II broke out, he said, "I've got to go. I know from experience what our boys are about to face. They need me." This time, however, he didn't enlist to heal the wounds of the body. As a minister, he was joining the Chaplain Corps to heal the wounds of the soul.
Reverend Clark V. Poling, he was from Columbus, Ohio, and he was pastoring in New York when the war broke out. He determined to enter the Army, but not as a chaplain. He said, "I'm not going to hide behind the church in some safe office out of the firing line." He's speaking this to his father. As he was about to, he's informing his father, "I'm going to enlist, I'm going to go." His father, Reverend Daniel Poling, knew something of war, having served also as a chaplain himself during World War I. And he told his son, "Don't you know that chaplains have the highest mortality rate of all? As a chaplain, you'll have the best chance in the world to be killed, only you can't carry a gun to kill anyone yourself." So with new appreciation for the role of chaplain, Clark Poling accepted a commission and followed in his father's footsteps.
Like Clark Poling, Alexander Good, who was from Brooklyn, had followed the steps of his own father in ministry. His first years of service were in Marion, Indiana. While studying and preparing to minister to the needs of others, Alex had joined the National Guard. 10 months before Pearl Harbor, he sought an assignment in the Navy's Chaplain Corps, but wasn't initially accepted. So when war was declared, he wanted more than ever to serve the needs of those who would be in harm's way to defend freedom and human dignity. So he chose to do so as a U.S. Army chaplain.
They said one look at the bespectacled, mild-mannered John P. Washington would have left one with the impression that he was not the sort of man to go to war and become a hero. His love of music and beautiful voice belied the toughness inside. One of 9 children in an Irish immigrant family living in the toughest part of Newark, New Jersey, he learned through sheer determination to hold his own in any fight. You see, by the time he was a teenager, he was the leader of the South 12th Street Gang. Then God called him to ministry, returning him to the streets of New Jersey to organize sports teams, play ball with the young boys who needed a strong friend to look up to, and inspire others with his beautiful hymns and praises of thanksgiving.
So in November 1942, these 4 young men found each other while attending chaplain school at Harvard. They had enough in common to bond them together, and the 4 men quickly became friends. One of Clark Poling's cousins later said, "They were all very sociable guys who seemed to have initiated interfaith activities even before the war. They hit it off well at chaplain school, and sharing their faith was not just a first-time deal for them. They were really very close. They had prayed together a number of times before that final crisis." The observation pointed out by Clark's cousin is of note because the 4 men of whom he spoke were unique. Their close bond might have easily marked them as the 4 chaplains, long before a fateful night 3 months after they first met, when their actions would forever make the title synonymous with the account we now know as the 4 chaplains. The differences in their backgrounds and personalities could have been easily outweighed by their common calling in ministry, had it not been for one major difference. In a world where differences have all too often created conflict and separated brothers, the 4 chaplains found a special kind of unity in which they found strength. Despite these differences, they became brothers because they had one characteristic in common that overshadowed everything else. They all 4 shared the same Father.
The USAT Dorchester was an aging luxury coastal liner. However, by this point in its life, it was no longer luxurious. In the nearly 4 years from December 7th, 1941 to September 2nd, 1945, more than 16 million men and women were called upon to defend human dignity and freedom on 2 fronts. We know that in Europe and also in the Pacific. So moving large forces like this to the battlefield was a monumental effort, and every available ship was being pressed into service, and that's how the Dorchester became part of the story. As the Dorchester left New York for an Army base in Greenland, there were many dangers lying ahead. The sea itself was a dangerous place, especially in this area. It was known for ice flows and raging waters, gale force winds, sort of that track of the Titanic that we've heard about with the ice flows. The greatest danger, however, was the ever-present threat of German submarines, which recently had been sinking Allied ships at the rate of 100 per month. The Dorchester would be sailing through an area that had become infamous as Torpedo Junction. So finally, on February 2nd, the Dorchester was within 150 miles of Greenland, and one of the three escort ships, there were three Coast Guard escort ships that were with the Dorchester, they received sonar readings from these ships indicating the presence of an enemy submarine in Torpedo Junction. Aware of the potential for disaster, the captain instructed the soldiers to sleep in their clothes and life jackets just in case. Below deck, however, as we said, it was very cramped, it was very hot, sweaty bodies, people packed in, and the men were not comfortable with that. So many of them took off the life preservers and just stripped down to just the bare minimum of what they needed to be able to stay in that very inconvenient place. Many of the men, confident though that with the dawn, without incident, they would be off and on their way. There were 902 lives about to be cast to the mercy of the frigid North Atlantic. With so many men cramped in that small space, all of them were in need of a ray of hope, spiritual guidance, anything they could get that would afford them the ability to get through a tough time. Those differences between all of them no longer seem to be very important. All the soldiers shared the same level of misery. They all shared the same level of fear, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. The title rabbi, father, or reverend was of little consequence to these men when they needed a chaplain.
So on the early dark hours of February 3rd, this German submarine, U-223, spotted the troop transport ship slipping through the icy waters. In the distance, a cold metal arm broke the surface of the stormy seas. The captain monitored the slowly passing troop transport, and shortly before 1 in the morning, he gave the command to fire their torpedoes at the Dorchester. Quiet moments passed as silent death reached out for the men of the Dorchester, and then the early morning was shattered by the flash of a blinding explosion and the roar of massive destruction. One of the torpedoes hit the middle of the ship. There was pandemonium on board, and the Dorchester swiftly began to sink. The hit tossed the men from their cots with the force of its explosion. A second torpedo followed the first, instantly killing 100 men in the hull of the ship. Power was knocked out in the engine room, and darkness engulfed the frightened men below deck as water rushed through gaping wounds in the Dorchester's hull. The ship tilted at an angle as it began to sink rapidly, and piles of clothing and life jackets were tossed about in the darkness where no one would ever find them. Wounded men cried out in pain, frightened survivors screamed in terror, and everyone groped frantically in the darkness for exits they couldn't find. Slowly, soldiers began to find their way to the deck of the ship, where they were confronted by the cold winds blowing down from the Arctic. Somewhere in that living abyss, 4 voices of calm began to speak words of comfort, seeking to bring order to panic and bedlam. They calmly led the soldiers and sailors to evacuation points.
In the chaos, the 4 chaplains were doing, well, what you would expect chaplains to do. They were providing comfort, guidance, and hope. A soldier named William B. Bednar would later recall, "I could hear men crying and pleading and praying. I could also hear the chaplains preaching courage. Their voices were the only thing," he said, "that kept me going." Petty Officer John J. Mahoney, reeling from the cold, was headed back to his cabin where he was hopefully trying to find some gloves to stay warm. He heard a voice say, "Where are you going?" "Well, to get my gloves," Mahoney replied. "Here, take these," said Rabbi Good, as he handed him a pair of gloves to that young officer who never would have survived had he gone back to his cabin and then back out on the deck to safety. "I can't take those gloves," Mahoney replied. "Never mind," said the rabbi. "I have 2 pairs." Mahoney slipped the gloves over his hands and returned to the frigid deck, never stopping to ponder until later, when he had reached safety, that there was no way Rabbi Good would have been carrying a spare set of gloves. As that thought finally dawned on him, Mahoney came to the realization of what was transpiring in the mind of the fearless chaplain. Somehow, Rabbi Good suspected that he himself would never leave the Dorchester alive. Before boarding the Dorchester back in January, Reverend Poling had asked his father to pray for him. He said, "Not for my safe return, that wouldn't be fair. Just pray that I'll do my duty, that I won't be a coward, and I'll have the strength and the courage and the understanding of men. Just pray that I'll be adequate." He probably never dreamed that his prayer request would be answered so fully as he guided the frightened soldiers to their only hope of safety from the rapidly sinking transport. He spoke calm words of encouragement, urging them not to give up. In the dark hall of the Dorchester, he was more than adequate. He was a hero. And likewise, Reverend Fox, Father Washington, stood out within the confines of an unimaginable nightmare. Wounded and dying soldiers were ushered into eternity to the sounds of comforting words from men of God, more intent on the needs of others than their own safety and survival. The strength, calm, and organization of the chaplains had been so critical in the dark hall. Somehow, by their valiant efforts, the chaplains succeeded in getting many of the soldiers out of the hold and up onto the Dorchester's slippery deck. Now, on deck, they found that their mission had not been fully accomplished, so they organized efforts to direct men to safety and left them with parting words of encouragement.
In little more than 20 minutes, the Dorchester was almost gone. Icy waves broke over the railing, tossing men into the sea, many of them without life jackets. In the last moments of the transport's existence, the chaplains were too occupied opening lockers to pass out life jackets to note the threat to their own lives. And with the Dorchester rapidly taking on water, there were not enough life jackets readily available for every man on the ship. So when the jackets ran out, the chaplains removed their own and handed them to soldiers who didn't have them. Those who had been fortunate enough to reach lifeboats struggled to distance themselves from the sinking ship. As the lifeboats pulled away, the survivors, looking back, saw the slanting deck of the Dorchester, its demise almost complete. Braced against the railings were the 4 chaplains, praying, singing, giving strength to others by their final valiant declaration of faith. Their arms were linked together as they braced against the railing and leaned into each other for support. Reverend Fox, Rabbi Good, Reverend Poling, and Father Washington. Then, amid the screams of pain and horror that permeated the cold, dark night, was heard the strong voices of chaplains praying, "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Said one of the survivors, "It was the finest thing I have ever seen this side of heaven." And then only 27 minutes after the first torpedo struck, the last vestige of the Dorchester disappeared beneath the cold North Atlantic waters, taking with it to its grave the 4 ministers of different faiths. Those servants had learned to find strength in their diversity by focusing on the Father they shared. More than 600 men died that night in the frigid seas, but some 230 were rescued. On that day, those military chaplains made their father very proud.
So that's the story of the Dorchester and the story of the four chaplains. And I think they are the representation of the John passage where Jesus said, greater love has no person than to lay down their life. So people, men and women, have been laying down their lives for us for a very long time to keep us safe. They were the ones that had courage. It has been tradition that with the death of military service personnel, that there is often a service, and at that service, taps would be played. So in a moment, we are going to do just that. I'm going to ask that you, in just a second, that you rise and that we honor all of those that have gone before, that have lost their lives in service to the country. Would you stand, please, as you're able?